Architecture and the act of construction have been described as confrontational, an act of violence of culture on nature. That was Fairfen. A suggestion of the oscillation of the word alteration into altercation is a stirring up, being at odds, being versus. And this perhaps echoes a reductive conflation in recent and current architectural practice of the existing being formulated as the other, and the existing as only existing building, which establishes a clear distance and a very specific fixed relational position. So my interest in alteration, altercation is that both are concerned with the other, but to different degrees of amiability. We can conceive of other place, other time, other history, other culture, other architects, other clients, other constructions, other technologies, other sites, other climates, other environments. Complexities arise when delving into which other has most importance and why: place, time, history, culture, site, architects, etc. And let alone what the attitude to each is. How amiable, individually and collectively, is the attitude which is the focus and foundation of activity. How architects act or behave is connected with how they and we see, i.e. how we look for, look at and know. And I'm concerned with understanding and exploring this techne of the architect. What are our personal, collective, disciplinary habits and routines of seeing, and in particular seeing the existing? Through the subject of field/work and site/work, where there is direct engagement and encounter with the existing, this aspect of architectural technique can be scrutinised. It's an unfixed position, and so has potential to understand and critique refreshed practices, which may be more dialogic and less dialectic towards the complexities of the existing. So in this presentation, I aim to offer a visual summary of the practices, sites and techniques which we examine in the book, Architecture and Fieldwork. I've got a copy here, which I'm delighted to leave. And the critical conclusions from this collective project as a very loose inflection of how we might develop strategies of architecture alteration practice, and to use Katarina's term, alteration design, such as survey, recording, inspection, adjustment, evaluation of existing buildings, cities, infrastructure, landscape. So how we might act more precisely and knowingly as designers. I footnote my presentation with some reflections on my own habits of seeing the existing, with observations of everyday alterations in my own domestic field, where I, by definition, am more proximate. This quotation is from the current Detail magazine, which some of you might know, and demonstrates that this is a live and increasingly pertinent issue in the professional architectural press. An ongoing concern, though, of construction technology in particular. In the language of this extract, legitimacy, reaction, quality, best way, deliberate, we see that careful moral and legal readings and scalings of work are at stake. In the United Kingdom, historic building legislation is now deeply embedded in an establishment position which affects architectural design and has permeated most council planning departments. The good modern, in contrast with the old, is generally an acceptable architectural strategy in response to historic building and city situations. Here, the journal frames their edition as refurbishment. So that is something to do with continuity of use, but replacement of material. As Tim indicated yesterday, there's many vocabularies of terms associated with alteration to existing constructed and inhabited fabric, primarily at the scale of building or a building complex, but potentially applicable to city, infrastructure or landscape. Other terms and possible strategies for systems, spaces, fabric, occupation, history are retrofit, where technology is added. There's a refit for purpose. Refurbishment suggests renewing, refreshing, cyclical renewal. There's a material emphasis on fixtures and fittings. Renovation implies dilapidation, material and structural focus. Upgrading suggests services, energy efficiency, and progressive improved comfort. To extend is a spatial, occupational addition. To underpin is a structural remedial action. To demolish is quite an extreme alteration. To maintain and repair is in the world of the stewarding and the caring for fabric. And of course, there are the natural processes of neglect and decay, the social political motivations of change of use, and I'm interested when the terms start to get much more belief orientated and we start talking about buildings being converted or saved, but that's perhaps for another discussion. Now, all these kind of terms that I've noted are part of everyday practice for architects. They require particular skills of survey work, and I'm interested in what this is for architects. So typically there's things within this, the condition survey, the material survey, site inspection, snagging, defects inspections. Certainly in the UK we have a 12-year period where your insurance period requires you to have a commitment to the performance of the building. These are pragmatic, but I would suggest there's 3 phases which I'm going to pick up again in the fieldwork presentation. So firstly, there's a scope setting. What is the work, the scope of the work. Secondly, there's a field work or a site work of observation, recording by eye, notes, marked up drawing, photograph, measure, inventory. And increasingly more advanced techniques borrowed from archaeology and empirical work with existing material, the photogrammetric survey, digital scanning, sectioning. And thirdly, what happens to all that material that's collected? And in the architectural activity, it's analysed, actions are selected, specifications, instructions, communication and representations begin in terms of the process of design and acting. So this all still remains within the canon of the existing building. And there's little scope for recording in this context other cultural, political, social, temporal, everyday aspects of the existing, which perhaps can be gained from fieldwork practices. Within the detail essay, you can just explicate some of the roots of the clear formulation of old versus new and associated architectural design strategies, which have become quite mainstream. Transitions are celebrated, interfaces between history and modernism, the unadorned, not concealed, accentuating transitions, sanctifying the profane craftsmanship qualities. In John Twomey's thoughtful essay, The Permanence of Building, as both noun and verb, I suggest, and a temporal dimension are acknowledged. So perhaps there's more emphasis here on good or bad building, rather than differential values ascribed to new and old of the conservation discourse. The original is identified as something to be respected if it's good, and this is manifest as legibility. Twomey's essay, Form, Time and Construction, significantly is rooted in a position of learning by working with buildings, and the critical knowledge at the forefront here is that of construction, histories of construction, detailing and building, communication of and for production, site sequencing, management and integration of different skills and trades, and caring for this as a process, core architectural activity. And would be a lovely dialogue with the Fontana world that Tim so eloquently introduced us to. Architecture is a project and endeavour that takes place over time, is generally lengthy in duration, has a lifespan, yet is also of time. It holds potential to be amended, added to, and present an openness of the unfinished or future potential that is essential to past, present and future life that the building will enable, as well as a holder of collective meaning. Now, working with existing buildings, which is not necessarily the same as working with the existing, requires both local knowledge of specific condition, situation, adaptations made, and also the expertise of the behaviour, performance and effect of material construction at all scales. Micro and macro rigours are required, an ability to understand the integrated construction in detail, how this was conceived in principle and as a whole, and how it might be adjusted, remedially decomposed, unfixed, in order to improve, alter, retrofit, etc. A sampling of conditions and key adjustments to be made are extracted and set up as key principles, strategic specification and perhaps tactical action. Now, by widening the lens to field work, we cannot just talk of existing buildings as the existing, but we have to account for a more complex context. The book that I've mentioned arose from the conference that Tim mentioned, which was the first project which exchanged ideas, knowledge, disciplinary, interdisciplinary connections to set out the scope, perhaps, of a field. This project relied on being loose and open around the edges, leaving spaces to be filled or defined or desaturated and informally disseminated. The second project, the book, was part of the series by the AHRA called Critiques, and was defined by resolving and finishing with aspiration for some durability of its content with specific disciplines. As an artifact, it comprised 14 authors, texts, black and white images, introductions by the editors, a consolidated bibliography and index, and in a predominantly academic set format. Now, my third project I identify as the process of editing, which was situated in a very tight production timetable. The four of us as editors met together every 2 weeks for 4 months, and our aim was to bring forward and generate and articulate themes, sequences, adjacencies, balancing attention to detail with the choreographing of the extensive scope, potentially, of the book's theme. We always intended that the images in the book would be a visual playing out of the content of work in, of, from, and into the field. So I'm using the opportunity of this presentation to perhaps do this as another iteration of the project. This is the cover image. It's a matrix of photographs taken by a Master of Architecture student from Edinburgh, Emma Bush, while on our studio trip to Cadiz in southwest Spain in 2006. The market seller sets up this trestle to ply his goods twice a week, alongside others on the outside perimeter of the enclosed fruit, fish and meat market situated in the old town of Cadiz. Several students were fascinated by the urban and spatial gradations of the market, how it contributed to the vitality of this part of the city. The permanent stands overflowing with fruits of the sea and the land inside the existing main market, which is behind the wall on this image, the pedestrian scale of use and portability in the tightly scaled streets of the old town, the temporary stalls situated around the perimeter of the single-storey walls, the daily and weekly rhythms of setting up, dismantling, adjacencies of types of goods, the historical knowledge of the original arcaded building, enclosing a rectangular field in the city where livestock would graze, and the current fragility of this neighbourhood in the city, where urban plans are mooting to move the market to another location more accessible to loading and unloading vehicles and distribution to the wider metropolitan area. This studio trip and the field work that we undertook, individually and collectively, formed a significant part of the subsequent development of architecture design thesis propositions, where some of these preoccupations, working through seeing the existing as field work, are seen in the individual inquiries. Some of the titles were Value, Displacement over Time, Productive Landscapes, and Architecture of the Unofficial City Frictions. So I would argue this fieldwork is a design practice. This is the contents of the book visually. The aim of the editing was to anchor work around architecture as a discipline, practice and field of action. We moved from the conference title Fieldwork to the book title Architecture and Fieldwork. There is a question about the relation of field to work and other to a self. Field work, as defined by other disciplines, in particular anthropology, and field and work, and what might the space between be. Architecture often appropriates from other disciplines. What emerged here is that as well as appropriations within and between both arts and science tendencies, so interpretive and empirical modes of research, architecture does have its own habits, repertoires, routines, which activate both theory and practice and the space between, and potentially offers something to other disciplines. So in structuring these three sections, an attempt was made to establish thoughtful, grounded evidence moving from practice, art, history, anthropology, architecture's historic intersections with anthropology, to the root of architecture's own habits, repertoires, routines in the sites and techniques sections. The field notes were documentary traces of the keynote presentations, which occupy interstices between the main sections. So in this book of essays, the range of techniques, conceptions and practices that have been collected and clustered offer productively pertinent beginnings of articulations and some unpacking of theory-practice oscillations in architectural practice at the point of engagement with the real field or site of a project or architectural practice. And I would like to argue a method and disposition of close looking, paying attention to, a heightened or exaggerated awareness may shed light in a new way, expose something new. In the essays in architecture and fieldwork, the question of how architects look, what for and why, has been positioned centrally, not just as a precursor to something more important, but as a mode of design, a potentially rigorous habit of mind and eye that is part of the architect's techne. The connections made between exploratory learning from fieldwork and the construction phase of building, site work, is interesting. This is the stage in an architectural project when urgent attention is to the real, and the change of the real is required. Not just a static existing ready to receive the new, but an active, morphing, potentially disruptive existing of the transformation, conditional, messy, requiring skill and judgment to negotiate well. There's a temporal dimension here where the process of the everyday market stall set up city licensing permissions may be as prescient as major decisions of earth moving to construct building foundations, or the error identified between drawing and building, which becomes highly contested. Each section in this book aims to establish a critical historiography or context, theoretical strategies, and then to contextualize reflective practices and more propositional work. In these first 4 essays, including one by Katerina, which is fantastic, after an outline of recent relevant anthropological discourse by Jeremy McGowan, a suggestion is made of the correlation between fictional fieldwork and architectural fieldwork. Fieldwork's a practice, not a discipline. It's practiced in different ways by different disciplines towards diverging ends, and it may contribute to the consolidating, deepening, and extending of disciplinary knowledge. In architecture, this is a tacit design knowledge, a resource for the study of site and the making of projects, enacted by learnt strategies, techniques and skills, rather than by disciplinary-driven models of applied methods or articulated methodologies. Practice can be conceived of as an artful doing, thinking on our feet, where knowledge is inherent, learnt, draws from experience and from what has gone before to connect with feelings, to attend to theories in use, and to construct new understandings which inform actions in unfolding situations and may engender ways of thinking about what it might be to practice within a disciplinary framework in several ways. Conceptions of site as fixed and specific, alongside more fluid interpretations of field and unfixed networks, are the setting for the next 5 essays. Field, like site, can be understood as a condition operating between, as well as a condition of, design intention and resolution, architectural idea and built construction. These next 5 essays acknowledge architecture as a gleaning discipline with its own and appropriated habits and repertoires, offering generative potential for architectural fieldwork as a critical design practice operating between representation and construction. The focus becomes mediating techniques. What are the accumulations of new material that become new existings, whether survey recording, inventory, photography, or video? And this may be where the creative practice of design and research become most pertinent to this discussion about alteration. What would a collection of forensic samples or a series of films of a threatened building or site be? And how might these lead to new ways of making decisions for action? In the book, we observed many intriguing sets of adjacencies. One is the early 1970s United States, with revisits of the research educational practices of Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Steve Eisenhower in Las Vegas, the art practices of Robert Smithson, his collaborators in New Jersey, and the influential urban analysis practices of William Hollymite in Manhattan, which set up a lot of the standard practices of urban design today. This perhaps positions more recent architectural design, education and fieldwork, working with the distressed post-industrial American city. Another thread of thought, and something that I think is relevant to the mediating techniques here, is the visual texture of this volume. All these images are individual and collaborative accounts of reflection in action, reflection on action. All these are made by the authors. So they position the authors as architectural field workers, beyond participant observers of anthropology, but participant makers of architecture, which I'm suggesting is how we might conceive architectural fieldwork. The making has begun here in the field, or reflection in or on the field, as selected photograph, notebook, marked up catalogue, documented reenactment of others' field art practices, record sheet, superimposed Polaroid, visual essay, drawn trace of an architect's on-site conservation with a builder, overmarked drawing, detail scrutiny, video strip, digital stills, forensic collection. Having to figure out what to collect, what to select, what to draw, what to film, what to mark up, is an act of making. And this recurring engagement with non-textual output, although familiar to us in architecture, agitates conventional anthropological paradigms, and within an ethnographic term, which is positioned by Jane Rendell in an ending essay in the book, encourages review of relationships between visual, aesthetic, fieldwork output and construction and design, where existing discourses and techniques of the visual, the aesthetic, the critical and the spatial overlap with those of anthropology, archaeology and ecology. Possibilities of performative modes of scholarship, the unmethodical, the unfinished as creative practices, and the architecture as someone who might navigate this, as well as being a constructor, are posited. And I'll now run through all the images at a larger scale for your browsing. Value in field work in architecture has tended to focus on artifact and conservation, the classical ruin or monument of the Grand Tour, the modernist project of archaeologically influenced vernacular studies, material conservation projects, and more recently, environmental rhetorics of the deep ecology movement. Is the privileging of the contemporary, the at-hand, the everyday, such as the casinos of Las Vegas, the recycling networks of Lagos, ultimately just another aesthetic project? Or is it a catalyst for a paradigmatic shift of knowledge-based practice? What's fieldwork for? Is it an end in itself, or does it lead to something else? I would argue that fieldwork can be seen as a form of critical realism. Acknowledgement and working with the circumstantial, the unfinished, the decayed, the abstract conditions of sight is an essential practice skill of architects with a view to offering propositions which are ultimately definitive, finished and sustainable. Associated techniques and routines of site work, such as the site visit, site study, site survey, site analysis, condition survey, setting out, snagging, certification, constitute habitual components of architectural practice, assemblages of knowledge, to quote Burns and Kahn. Practical knowledge engages with thinking and theorizing of thinking over time and becomes tacit through practiced habits, routines, vocabularies. Site work, like field work, is a circumstantial subject dependent on the ethical position of a designer, couched in the prevailing collective value systems of the profession and the immediate culture, potentially complicit with tactics for project-based resolutions. This is a summary of my introduction in the book, which has some of the text you've heard from. So I just conclude with my footnotes. Now, these are very much my visual footnotes, and they're sort of my working as I was thinking about this paper. These are all images taken on my iPhone as I reflected on a 1997 visit to Stockholm and what I was looking at and paying attention to. I was in practice at that point, and last year a more recent design workshop with academics and other disciplines in Warsaw. And I observed that my practices and habits have changed over that time. And this is my everyday existing. I was pondering here Alteration. This is a piece of infrastructure on the north edge of Edinburgh, where the issue of alteration as maintenance, as care, we get the clashes. There's some altercation here between different constructional strategies. The ad hoc, the making do that was talked about yesterday. The clashes between different proprietors, the Harbour Authority, the City Council, different conceptions of what to do with historic paving in a World Heritage City. This is my house, which was altered over time. And I suppose what I'm interested, I mean, this is almost like a shadow paper that I can't develop here, but I'm interested in how this is almost marking my time. It's a kind of connection to how I live and how we alter. The blue front was the house looking over the sea to the north. This is a more obvious, our upper story addition to our house over an existing 19th century cottage. And we added this garden staircase, and just a few months ago we replaced what were the original scaffolding steps with these rather more pristine upgraded oak treads. So just to conclude, the project of alteration should be conceived as much about rigour, disposition, speculation and imagination as any new architectural design project. Seeing the existing as more and sometimes less than existing building means we have to draw on from experience and develop relevant habits of seeing, which are of course habits of mind and hand as well. And these are practiced, appropriated and have to be reflected on and critiqued. The habitual can become a repository for tacit design knowledges, artful doing. Fieldwork in architecture and architects as participant makers may offer a range of tactics and strategies for seeing the existing and making what exists. Thank you.